Chapter 13. Melifere tried to stand, but a single glance from the Dark One, she could no longer think of the black-robed man with his malevolent expression as the Doctor, froze every muscle in her body. Immobile, she could only watch as the Archimage committed the ultimate heresy. He had uttered the forbidden name. "Your arrival is most timely," the Dark One told the Archimage. "Indeed, I doubt that I could have stood much more of these prattling women." The Archimage smiled and glanced at the inferno that was raging next to them, its effects held at bay by a sparkling barrier of protection. "Our departure is also timely, Valliard. Let us leave Melifere and Anastasia to the flames. An apt fate for a brace of witches, don't you think?" They strode from the annex in a flurry of gold and black cloaks. Melifere was immediately released from her paralysis and leapt to her feet. "The fire!" screamed the Hierophant, panic in her voice. "My powers are still depleted from the Archimage's attack." "Calm yourself." The Technomancer held her hands out in front of her and muttered a brief incantation. The wall of flame froze and then evaporated like a spent cloud. Melifere sighed. "I'm sorry about the damage. Molecular regeneration isn't one of my fortes." The Hierophant used the desk to lever herself to her feet. "The damage is irrelevant. A few scorched books mean little if the great kingdom is in danger, and what we have just seen in this annex did nothing to reassure me." The Technomancer nodded. Until the Doctor's terrifying transformation, she simply didn't believe that he was the Dark One of the prophecies. But now, the costume had been exactly as described in the Eldritch texts, and hadn't he answered to the darkest of dark names, that of Valliard? Given that evidence, there was no reason to doubt that he also possessed the power to topple the kingdom and bring chaos down on them all. She began to wonder whether she should ever have trusted him in the first place. There was something else. The Hierophant broke off and frowned. "Did you notice anything odd about Ashmael?" "No." And then Melifere realized that there had been something not quite right about him. His garments were darker, more warlike in their cut, and his attitude was more belligerent than my Cybrid spies have indicated. The Hierophant nodded. "And there's more. I'm attuned to every aspect of the labyrinth and the Thaumaturg settlements, but I didn't detect the Archimage's arrival until he entered the annex." The Technomancer shrugged. "He is a ruler of the great kingdom." "As are you, Melifere," she interrupted, "but every step of your journey here was observed by my Thaumaturgs." She closed her eyes, and the Technomancer could feel the psychic communications spreading throughout and beyond the labyrinth. And then a swirl of astral energy materialized in the center of the annex, a whirling vortex of greens and golds. "What are you doing?" "Ashmael attacked and murdered one of my Thaumaturgs. I want to know what happened to it." Even as she spoke, the energy resolved into the spindly figure of a Thaumaturg, translucent but stable. Melifere was amazed. Although she knew that it was possible to reach beyond the veil of death, she had thought that such knowledge had been lost after the last war of the gods. In spite of her resentment towards the Hierophant, she was impressed by the older woman's abilities. If she could conquer death, what else was she capable of? For the first time since the arrival of the Thaumaturg emissary, she felt a glimmer of hope. She suddenly realized that the Hierophant was addressing the spirit. "What transpired, Shade?" "The Archimage was shielded by wards of great power, Bibliotrix," it explained in a tremulous voice. "He passed through the settlement without alerting anyone. Only when he reached the roof of the labyrinth did he allow himself to be detected. I prepared to attack him, but he—" It fell silent, an expression of shame on its puckered grey face. "Continue," commanded the Hierophant. "Then the Archimage possessed me, Bibliotrix. He reached into my mind and forced me to unlock the mystic wards that guard you." The creature was positively babbling. The Hierophant raised an eyebrow. "Such abilities are unheard of. The Archimage should be incapable of controlling a Thaumaturg, just as I cannot ensorcel one of his Oryx. Unless—" She dismissed the ghostly image with a wave of her hand and watched as its translucent form faded into nothing. "How has he gained such powers?" asked the Technomancer urgently. "How has he done this?" The Hierophant sighed. "Such things are possible, but never spoken of." She walked over to the burnt bookcase and ran a finger through the charred remains. "The Magnus Ashmael, Archimage of Abraxas, has stolen a fraction of the power of the gods. And by doing that, he is a greater threat to the kingdom than the Dark One ever was. Once again, shielded by unbreachable wards, the Archimage strode through the darkness of the Thaumaturg settlement, the Valeyard at his side. Although the settlement was bustling with the nocturnal activities of the Thaumaturgs, their passage went unnoticed. "Such power, Ashmael," commented the Valeyard. "I begin to wonder why you need me." "I was already mighty, Valeyard." The vicarious thrill he received just saying the forbidden name was intoxicating. "But with you by my side, I shall be omnipotent." The Valeyard stopped and looked at him, an unfathomable look in his eyes. "Omnipotence is a relative term, Ashmael. How great is your ambition? Will you settle for control of the great kingdom? Or do you desire the enslavement of the gods themselves?" Or his voice lowered. "Or do you thirst for the world beyond the wall of tears, the universe that can be yours if you grasp the wider picture?" The Archimage allowed the Valeyard's words to sink in. Until now, he had not thought beyond control of the kingdom, but the universe beyond the electric blue barrier, the universe that the gods had denied them so long ago. He narrowed his eyes. "Such power. You could help me in this?" "Oh, yes," said the Valeyard seductively. "Yours is the power, but mine is the vision." He reached into his cloak and withdrew a thin black book. "Since the foundation of the kingdom, the Hierophant has always had the potential to be the greatest of the three rulers. The labyrinth contains the sum total of the knowledge of the gods scattered throughout the bookshelves. Only the blinkered minds of the Hierophant and her ancestors have prevented them from seizing total control of the kingdom." "Then we should return to the labyrinth," the Archimage said urgently. "Even together, the Hierophant and the Technomancer are no match for our combined might. We can wrest the power of the gods from under their very noses." "No, no, no, Ashmael," the Valeyard chided. "Now is not the time for knee-jerk demonstrations of brute force." "But you saw how easily she fell." The Valeyard held a hand up to silence him. "She was unprepared. She has since had time to garner her defenses, and I doubt that a rematch would have the same result, especially with that vixen Melefir at her side." "No, our course must be more subtle, more insidious." He waved the book in the Archimage's face. "This book contains the black scrolls of Cardinal Leofric de Sable, a powerful sorcerer from the universe beyond the wall." The Archimage was puzzled. "But the gods say that magic does not exist beyond the wall." Another of their lies. Throughout the centuries, there have been a few mortals who have recognized the dark science, and De Sable was one of them. He spent his life collecting multifarious incantations and words of power, and despite the fact that he understood nothing of the Aeneant language and knew even less about its correct use, he succeeded in compiling this single volume. The Archimage snorted with derision. One little pamphlet, compared with the corridors of books in the labyrinth. "If you would cease your constant interruptions, I'll explain," bellowed the Valeyard. "This one book is more powerful than the rest of the Hierophant's library put together. With this little pamphlet, Ashmael, we can breach the Wall of Tears and be the first to gaze on the outer world since the formation of the kingdom." The Archimage smiled broadly at the image. "To breach the Wall of Tears, and this book of Disables is all we need." It was the Valeyard's turn to smile. "Not exactly, no, but I'll explain in greater detail after we have reached the tower." He wrapped his ebony cloak around him. "This cool night air might be agreeable to the Thaumaturgs, but I find it most unpleasant." He gestured towards the misty wall that separated the Thaumaturg settlement from that of the Oryx. "Shall we go?" "I hated you." The words were clear and crisp in the still air of the staircase that descended into the depths of the labyrinth. "Ever since I was old enough to reason, I hated you from the depths of my soul." "And now?" Melefir shrugged. "I was wrong. I was told by my mother that you and the entire dynasty of Hierophants were responsible for the evil that beset the kingdom, that you would bring the Dark One amongst us and rain destruction upon us all." The Hierophant chuckled coldly. "And have I not done that? According to the doctor, this entire illusion, the great kingdom, has resulted from Anne Travers's interference. And who am I but Anne Travers under another guise?" Melefir stopped and placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "No, Anastasia, you are not. You are the Hierophant of the great kingdom, and you are no more Anne Travers than I am the doctor's friend Mel. Whatever magics were used to create the kingdom were far beyond our comprehension, let alone our abilities. All we can do now is ally our forces and try to bring the doctor back to us." The Hierophant smiled. "You are a good woman, Melifere. And if it has taken the threat of total annihilation for me to recognize that, then I'm glad." The Technomancer returned the smile just as warmly. "So am I, Anastasia, so am I. And if the doctor's soothsaying is proved wrong, and the kingdom survives, it will be a new era of cooperation between our two houses." "Then let us start that cooperation now," said the Hierophant. "How easy would it be?" They walked down the staircase, deep in discussion. Bartholomew looked up as the giant crystal doors of the tower swung open, allowing two figures to enter. Unbelievably, the Oryx hadn't killed them. He, Luella, and Cassandra had been escorted back to the vestibule of the Tower of Abraxas. And for the last hour, they had been waiting for some unspecified fate and guarded by two Oryx. It just didn't make sense. And then he realized that he recognized who was coming through the doors. One was obvious. The Archimage in all his golden glory, although Bartholomew would have sworn that his armor was duller than normal. As for the other, the outfit was totally different, but horrifyingly familiar. The legendary garb of the Dark One, and the arrogant good humor of the face was twisted into a cruel sneer. It was the Doctor, obviously embracing his dark heritage with a vengeance. The Archimage waved a gauntleted hand around the vestibule. "Welcome to Abraxas, Valliard," he announced, and Bartholomew and Luella shot horrified looks at one another. The Archimage was hurling around the forbidden name as if it meant nothing. "Who are the two humans?" asked the Dark One, approaching them with measured strides. "Ah, yes, Melifire's elevated cybrids and their bastard whelp." He looked round. "What is their purpose here, Ashmael?" The Archimage nodded at the Auric guards, and even Bartholomew felt the intensity of the telepathic command. Immediately the homed creatures grabbed them. "They were roaming the Auric settlement. Since they are the Technomancer's closest confidants, I wondered whether they might be useful." He raised an eyebrow at the Dark One, who withdrew a small black book from his robes and leafed through the contents, before looking up with a malicious grin. "Oh yes, Ashmael, I can definitely find a use for one of them." And then he stared at Cassie. Bartholomew shuddered. "What you propose is, of course, heresy," said the Technomancer wearily. "Of course," laughed the Hierophant, "but when the old truths crumble to dust, heresy is often the only thing left." She strained at a heavy grey volume, easing it from the shelves of the endless corridor that they had arrived in. "And this is probably the greatest heresy contained within the labyrinth." She handed the book to Melifere, who read the faded gold lettering from the cover. "The Architecture of Peli." An odd title, but also an oddly familiar one, she realized. Indeed. But the knowledge of this book has been passed down from Hierophant to Hierophant since the foundation of the kingdom. She retrieved the book and opened it. It details the nature and the stiamcture of the Tower of Abraxas Melifire, and will tell us the best way to lay siege to it with our combined army of thaumaturgs and cybrids. "Ah," the Technomancer sighed, understanding why the Hierophant had asked her whether her cybrid troops could fight alongside thaumaturgs. "I take it we storm the tower and rescue the Doctor?" The Hierophant shook her head violently. "Oh no, Magistrix. We storm the tower and execute the Dark One. That is the only way." "Your throne room does you justice, Ashmael," muttered the Valliard, running his fingers over the golden window ledge. In truth, he found the man's obsession with gold irritating, to say the least. "But we are not here to exchange pleasantries. We are here to breach the wall of tears." He watched the horrified reaction of the cybrid things in the corner of the room with satisfaction. "Tell me more of what you saw in the tabernacle." The Archimage mounted his throne. "A nightmare, Valliard. The goddess in absence, the Lady Tardis, was on her plinth, while the forms of Sarah Quazel and Yog-Sothoth were joined in an unholy alliance." The Valliard rubbed his chin in contemplation. "The quantum mnemonic and that Hag Travers block transfer computation must have interacted, merging the two creatures in the process." His eyes glinted. "Very, very unpleasant. Very." He walked over to the window. "And I suppose you should know this as well." The superstrings which support the pocket of reality that comprises the great kingdom are unraveling. I can feel it. This pocket dimension is fundamentally unstable. He held up his hands. And before you bombard me with yet another question, Ashmael, I will explain it in words of less than one syllable. If the unraveling is not stopped, the great kingdom will dissolve into tiny, tiny particles that will be blown away on the time winds like so much flotsam. He raised a finger. The effects of the unraveling are already making themselves felt. Both Melifere and Anastasia remember shards of their other lives. Can your magics prevent this destruction? The Valeyard nodded. Yes, they can. In fact, it is a necessity. If I were to breach the Wall of Tears without stabilizing the space-time continuum, it would endanger the entire universe. And I doubt that all the power of the gods could contain that. He withdrew the book from his cloak once more and held it up. Within this, Disable has recounted both the incantations which will halt the unraveling, and those which will open a door in the wall. All that is needed is the life force of an innocent human to catalyze the release of the god's own power. The Archimage stood from his throne. But that is impossible, Valeyard. The only humans in the kingdom are the members of the 3 ruling families, and those creatures that we have elevated. He nodded at Bartholomew and Luella. But it is written that none of us is innocent, for we all share the blame for the evil that was the original sin. The Valeyard went over to the elevated Cybrids and snatched the child from Luella's arms, holding Cassandra up in triumph. But this infant is innocent, Archimage, born of elevated Cybrids. She is both truly human and truly innocent, the only such being in the kingdom, and her sacrifice will provide the means of accomplishing our goal. Bartholomew leapt forward and tried to wrest Cassandra from his hands. The Valeyard knocked him unconscious with a single thought, and then smiled. Have you a table and a knife, Archimage? Melifere looked up from the book. Once she had deciphered the odd language, she had begun the search for a weak spot in the strength of Abraxas, and that had proved to be simplicity itself. She pointed a finger at a line drawing of the building. This side entrance to the tower offers us the best chance, Anastasia. But what of the Archimage's oryx, Melifere? She countered. They will be ever vigilant. But the question was asked with a playful mischief. Why do I get the feeling that you have the answer to that one? Said the technomancer with a chuckle. Indeed I have, replied the Hierophant, holding up a tiny blue book. With this, and our powers combined, we can erect wards over our army, shielding it from observation so that we can approach the tower without detection. Have you summoned your Cybrids? The technomancer nodded. They are already massing on the plains of despair, but I still insist that we try to save the doctor rather than kill him. I have considered your proposal, Melifere, said the Hierophant, and I have discovered an incantation that might possibly bring the doctor's personality back to the surface. That's wonderful, she exclaimed, but... The Hierophant's voice was stern. The moment that I suspect that he is beyond redemption, I will kill him myself. Is that understood? Melifere nodded. Let's get on with it, then. The Hierophant gestured towards the stairs. My thaumaturgs await, Magistrix. Shall we go? They ascended the book-lined staircase with urgent steps, rapidly reaching the final flight of silvered slate. With a muttered incantation, the Hierophant opened the labyrinth to the ghostly dawn light and walked out onto the surface. The combined might of the thaumaturg and Cybrid armies had never before been seen under the azure sky of the great kingdom. The Cybrids were all dressed in simpler versions of the technomancer's blue armor, while the thaumaturgs wore heavy silver chainmail secured at the waist with dark grey belts. A glorious sight, muttered the Hierophant. She was also armoured, a delicate chainmail tunic and a skirt composed of strips of heavy silver. She was leaning on a dark steel staff. Truly a miracle, agreed the technomancer. They had reached a high promontory that overlooked the plains of the thaumaturg settlement, a point which offered a perfect view of the armies. Ready? Asked the Hierophant. Try and stop me, the technomancer squealed, before giggling nervously. A bit of Mel slipping through, no doubt. The Hierophant smiled and raised her staff. Advance, she commanded, watching as the thaumaturgs marched forward. Simultaneously, the technomancer held up her hand and reached out mentally to her Cybrids, urging them to march in step with their silver colleagues. Melifere was close enough to Hierophant to hear her murmured prayer, "And may the gods have mercy on all our souls." Bartholomew woke up to find himself propped up against a wall of the Archimage's throne room, his head throbbing. Slowly and painfully, Luella's face resolved out of the blur. And then he corrected himself. She wasn't Luella. Luella was part of another world. The woman leaning over him was Louise Mason, mother of his daughter. "Thank God you're all right, Barry," she said urgently. "They've got Cassie." Barry, because he was Barry Lawrence Brown of Catford in London, not that phantom Bartholomew, struggled to his feet. On the far side of the room, the doctor was leaning over a massive golden table, a knife glinting in his hand. For some reason, he was wearing long black robes, and Cassie's prone form was lying on the table. Barry's heart raced, and he ran over to rescue her. At least he tried to. An invisible barrier had been erected around them, and he smashed into it with a shocking coruscation of light. Winded, he stepped back. "Let me out of here!" he screamed, banging on the transparent wall and getting only golden sparks in return. Beyond the barrier, the doctor looked round from his unholy pursuits. "Ah, woken up, have we?" He grinned. "Please try to be quiet, will you? I'm about to cut your mewling bridling's throat, and I'll make a cleaner cut without your irritating disturbances." "That's my daughter you've got out there, you bastard!" There was only one thought in Barry's mind, and that was to get out and hug the child that had been denied a real part of his real life. The doctor was positioning the knife against Cassie's bare throat. He ignored Barry and turned to the Archimage. "Once the jugular is cut, the life force will ebb rapidly. You must recite the incantation when I give you the signal." The Archimage nodded and picked up the open book, and the knife sliced downwards.